He thought he inherited nothing more than an old, crumbling house from a distant uncle. But behind the closet wall, a hidden passage waited, filled with dust, cobwebs, and secrets that had been sealed for decades. Inside lay crates, a child's rocking chair, carvings scratched deep into stone, and a trunk bound in rusted iron. What he uncovered were not treasures, but chilling confessions, names, disappearances, and his uncle's silent ties to them all. Now the house is no longer just a home. It is a witness, and with one discovery, so is he. Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The letter had arrived without warning. Its neat script and heavy paper, carrying the kind of formality that no one expected in an age of emails and text messages. He had opened at the kitchen table, the morning light dull across unpaid bills, his coffee cooling beside him. The name on the envelope had been familiar only in passing. The memory of a distant uncle mentioned briefly at family gatherings and never with warmth. The man was gone now, and in his absence he had left behind something that was supposed to be an inheritance, though it felt far more like a test. A house in a town he had never visited, a key, and a deed tucked into the folds of the letter. When he first drove into the narrow street, the air itself seemed older. Weeds climbed up broken sidewalks, and the trees pressed in heavily on both sides of the road. The house sat at the end like a sentinel, its roofline jagged where shingles had slipped free, its windows dull by years of grime. The porch sagged under its own weight, railings leaning outward as though tired of standing guard. He parked with the engine running, watching it for a long time to the windshield, uncertain if he should turn the key or leave the car in reverse and drive away. The house had once been grand. That much was obvious even in its current state. The stonework around the foundation had been cut with care, the tall windows framed with ornamentation from another era. But time had not been kind. Paint peeled in long strips that revealed the gray wood beneath, and ivy had consumed half the western wall. A condemned notice, years old and bleached nearly white, still clung to the gate, unreadable but still carrying its silent warning. When he stepped out of the car, the air was heavy with the scent of damp wood and earth. His footsteps crunched on gravel as he walked toward the porch, the old brass key cold in his pocket. Every board he stepped on groaned, and flakes of paint fell when he touched the railing. At the front door, he paused. The lock resisted at first, the key grinding against unseen rust, until finally, with a reluctant click, it gave. The sound echoed too loudly, as if the house had noticed him. Inside, the air was stale and sharp with the scent of dust and mildew. His eyes adjusted slowly, shapes emerging in the dim light that filtered through half-closed shutters. The wallpaper curled in long strips, exposing plaster beneath. A chandelier hung low in the foyer, every crystal coated in grime, a monument to neglect. He set his bag on the floor, and the sound of it hitting the board sent up a small cloud of dust. The staircase rose before him, the banister carved with craftsmanship that spoke of wealth long vanished. He reached out, tracing the design, and felt it would soften under his touch where rot had eaten its way inside. The floor creaked with every step he took, announcing his presence to whatever might be listening. The rooms off the hallway yawned open, their doors hanging crooked on rusted hinges. In what had once been the parlor, the wallpaper was patterned with faded roses, now stained with watermarks from a roof that had leaked for too long. An armchair sat against the far wall, its fabric torn and stuffing spilling out. A fireplace lay choked with ash that had turned to stone. The silence in the room pressing around him until he cleared his throat, just to remind himself that sound still existed. He opened another door to find a dining room, the long table warped and split down the center. The chairs around it seemed to wait for occupants who would never return. Dust layered every surface, thick enough to soften the edges of things. A single plate rested at the head of the table, its porcelain cracked. He found himself wondering if it had been left there deliberately, or if it sat untouched for decades, waiting for someone who never came back. Each room carried the same weight. Echoes of life long ended, objects left behind to decay in silence. He felt none of the excitement an inheritance was supposed to bring. Instead, there was only the heaviness of responsibility. Repairs would cost more than he could ever afford. The house was a burden disguised as a gift, and he knew it. As he stood in the doorway of the dining room, he caught sight of a hallway mirror, its surface dull with age. His own reflection stared back faintly, superimposed on the ghost of another time. Behind him the house loomed, not welcoming him but holding him in place. He had inherited not just walls and beams, but secrets buried in dust and neglect. What unsettled him most was a feeling that the house was waiting. For what? He couldn't yet tell. He carried his boxes upstairs slowly, each step creaking beneath the weight of his footsteps. The rooms had not been touched in years, perhaps decades, and every surface seemed to sigh with dust as he passed. The bedroom he chose was the least damaged of them all, though the plaster along one corner had bubbled and cracked from water that must have seeped in from the roof. A faded rug lay across warped boards, and against the far wall stood a tall closet door, its paint blistered but still holding the brass handle steady. He set the boxes down and sat on the edge of the bed frame, tried to imagine what it would mean to live here. The afternoon light stretched across the floor, showing lines of dust disturbed by his movements. He opened the first box and began pulling out shirts and folded pants, placing them neatly into the closet. The hinges squealed in protest when he pulled the door open, revealing a narrow interior lined with old cedar planks. The scent of it clung faintly, a reminder of its intended purpose long ago, though it was now more mildew than cedar. He reached inside to hang his clothes and felt the space with his hand, noting how shallow it seemed. The wall was closer than he expected. At first he thought it was only his imagination, the weariness of unpacking after a long drive. But as he placed each hanger carefully onto the rusted rod, the thought would not leave him. Something about the proportions was wrong. He stepped back into the room and looked at the closet against the wall. From the outside, the wall ran flat across to the far corner. But when he paced the length of the room, counting steps, the distance did not match what the closet offered. He opened the door again, peering into the shadowy interior, then back at the wall beside it. It seemed as though the closet ended too early, as though there should be more depth behind the back panel than what his hand found. Curiosity pushed him further. He walked into the hallway and measured with his eyes how far the outer wall of the house extended beyond the bedroom. Returning inside, he traced the distance on the floorboards with careful steps, then compared it with the depth of the closet. His stomach tightened. The measurements did not align. There should have been nearly 2 more feet of space between the back of the closet and the outer wall, but there was nothing, at least nothing visible. Kneeling down, he studied the floor of the closet more closely. The boards were darker here, stained by years of use. Near the rear edge, however, they seemed almost too smooth, as if something heavy had been dragged across the same section repeatedly, scarring the wood in faint but noticeable arcs. The marks led to the back panel, stopping where the planks met the wall. He placed his palm flat against the back, expecting solid resistance. Instead, the sound it made when he tapped echoed faintly. He knocked again, harder this time, and the hollowness was unmistakable. His breath caught, and for a long moment he did nothing. Crouched in the dim light of the closet, hand against a wall that should have been solid stone or brick, the thought unsettled him more than it should have. It was not unusual for old houses to have irregularities and use chimneys, walled-off alcoves, or voids left by renovations long forgotten. Yet here, in the silence a house inherited from an uncle he had never truly known, the hollow space behind the wall felt deliberate. He stood and closed the closet door, retreating back into the bedroom. The wall seemed to press closer now, as though aware of his discovery. He tried to distract himself by arranging more belongings, stacking books on the small desk and placing his shoes neatly beneath the bedframe, but his eyes kept drifting toward the closet door. Each time, the unease returned stronger than before. Later that evening, as the house settled into its nighttime groans and the wind pressed against the loose shutters, he found himself standing in front of the closet again, unable to resist. He opened the door slowly, the hinges screeching in the stillness. He reached out once more to touch the back wall, fingers tracing its surface. It was colder than the rest of the room, a chill that spread up through his arm. He stepped back quickly, his heart beating harder than the situation warranted. He told himself it was only wood, only old boards warped with time. Yet, when he turned off the light and tried to sleep, he could not shake the image of those extra 2 feet of space hidden just beyond the closet. waiting in silence. Something was there, and tomorrow he knew he would have to face it. Morning came slowly, the pale light seeping through the torn curtains and casting thin shadows across the warped floorboards. He rose stiffly from the mattress, every sound in the house amplified in the silence. Pipes groaning somewhere in the walls, the faint rattle of loose window panes as the wind pressed against them. The house never seemed fully at rest, even in daylight. He dressed quickly, determined to look again at the closet. The unease from the night before had not faded. If anything, it had deepened, settling into his chest like a weight. He opened the door with more care than he meant to, as though the hinges themselves might resist his intrusion. Dust swirled in the air, stirred by his movement, catching the light from the window. He stepped inside, the wood under his shoes creaking. At first, he only meant to check the hollow sound he had noticed the night before, but his eyes were drawn downward. The floor of the closet told a story he hadn't seen in the dim light before. Scratches ran across the boards in faint arcs, some shallow, others carved deeply enough that his fingertips could trace their grooves. They were not random marks from time or decay. They had direction, shape, and repetition. Something heavy had been dragged here, again and again, pulled toward the back wall and away from it, leaving scars in the wood. He crouched, examining them closely, brushing aside layers of dust with his hand. The dust clung to his fingers, gray and fine, but the marks remained clear beneath. He followed one set of lines to where they ended at the seam of the back wall. There the scratches grew deeper, gouged into the planks as if whatever had been moved pressed hard under its own weight. He imagined a chest, perhaps a wardrobe, something dragged back and forth until it cut into the wood. The idea that furniture had once been pushed deliberately against the rear wall unsettled him. Why would anyone need to block that space so often unless they were hiding something? The boards themselves were worn smooth, the grain dulled by repeated friction. He placed both hands flat against them and pressed down, listening to the groan of old wood beneath his weight. Something about the way the scratches overlapped suggested urgency. Whoever had left them had not been careful. They had been quick, forceful, as though trying to seal something away in haste. He sat back on his heels, staring at the floor, the smell of dust thick in his nose. The air felt cooler in the closet, more still, as if the small space was sealed from the rest of the house. He stood and paced a slow circle, measuring the marks with his steps, noting where they started and stopped. The pattern repeated, always converging at the same place, the back wall that already rang hollow when tapped. Curiosity pressed harder than caution. He fetched a flashlight from his box of tools and shined the beam across the boards. Under the narrow light, more details appeared. Tiny splinters had broken away where the scratches were deepest, and in the crevices bits of rust-colored residue clung like dried iron. He could not decide if it was old stain or something less explainable. The sight made his stomach tighten. He stood again, brushing dust from his knees, and pressed his palm to the back wall. The chill was still there, unnatural compared to the rest of the room. He rapped his knuckles against the boards, and the echo was undeniable. The sound was not of solid wood anchored to brick, but of emptiness behind. He lingered with his hand on the wall, feeling the faint vibration of his knock reverberate back through the wood, as though the hollow space on the other side absorbed and returned it. Stepping back, he looked again at the scratch floor, and the image formed clearly now. Something had been kept here, hidden behind that wall, and something else or someone had wanted to conceal badly enough to drag heavy objects into place repeatedly. The thought made the room feel smaller, the walls pressing closer. He shut off the flashlight and stood in the dimness, the outline of the closet door behind him a narrow promise of escape. But he did not leave. Instead, he crouched once more, fingertips running along the scars in the wood, mapping the lines carved by unknown hands. He could almost see them, whoever they had been, sweating under the weight of whatever they dragged, desperate to seal away the back of the closet. The scratches were more than damage. They were testimony. The house was not just decaying. It was remembering. When he finally rose to his feet, the decision was already forming in his mind. He could not ignore this. The hollow wall, the mismatched measurements, the scratches carved deep into the boards. Each detail was a piece of a puzzle waiting to be solved. The room beyond was real, and he would have to see it. But as he closed the closet door behind him, the air seemed to whisper otherwise. as if the house itself would rather he left that secret untouched. The day stretched long with small tasks that never seemed to matter. Sweeping dust from corners, taping plastic over a broken window, tightening screws and old hinges. He worked through them as though distraction could quiet the thought that had been circling his mind since morning. Each time he passed the bedroom door, his eyes flicked toward the closet, and each time he looked away too quickly. But by late afternoon, when the sun had dulled and shadows began to stretch unevenly across the floor, he could no longer resist. The closet door stuck slightly when he pulled it open, the swollen wood catching against the frame before giving way with a faint shudder. The air inside was heavier than the rest of the room, still and unmoving, carrying a scent that felt older than dust alone. He stepped inside, crouched low, and pressed his hand once again to the back wall. His knuckles rapped against it firmly, the sound echoing faintly, hollow in a way that made his stomach twist. He knocked again, harder this time. The reverberation came back and even, as though it passed through more than just wood. The tone was not flat and solid but soft, almost muted, as if a pocket of air existed on the other side. He stood still, listening. The house gave no other answer. He leaned closer, ear against the wood, holding his breath. At first there was only silence, the kind that pressed against him like weight. Then something faint, almost too faint to be real, reached his ear. It was not a voice. It was not even a sound that could be named with certainty. It was an echo, distant and uncertain, as though the knock had traveled into a chamber and bounced back altered. He pulled away quickly, blinking at the dust that stirred with his movement. His heart pounded faster than the situation demanded. Rationality told him it was simply the hollowness of the wall, an unused space left behind by builders more than a century ago. But something in the quality of the sound unsettled him. Something in the way the echo lingered a half-second too long. He pressed his ear again, determined to prove to himself that it had only been imagination. The wood was cool, colder than the rest of the room, and it seemed to leach the warmth from his skin. He tapped lightly, this time with the tips of his fingers. The sound that returned was sharp. Clear at first, then hollowing as it faded, slipping into the kind of silence that begged to be listened to. He strained to hear more, his breath shallow, and for an instant he thought he caught the faintest shuffle, as though something shifted far behind the paneling. He jerked back, standing abruptly in the cramped space, head nearly brushing the doorframe. His throat was dry. Dust clung to his hands and hair, and the air in the closet felt thin, as though it resisted his breathing. He stepped out quickly into the bedroom where the light had already begun to fade toward evening. The ordinary space looked safer now, the edges of the furniture familiar, in contrast to the strange closeness of the closet. Yet the sound clung to him, refusing to be explained away. He found himself pacing the length of the room, tracing the outer wall with his steps once more. He opened the window and looked outside, studying how the structure extended beyond the room. There should have been no void, no hollow space. The measurements, the scratches, and now the echo all aligned into one conclusion. Something lay behind the wall, concealed deliberately. He returned once more, slower this time, each step deliberate. Inside the closet, he crouched and pressed his cheek flat to the wood. He closed his eyes and let the silence fill him. The faint hum of his own pulse filled his ears, but beneath it, he caught the same strange resonance. It was not the emptiness of ordinary construction. It was the emptiness of a chamber, of space waiting unseen. His hand slid down the paneling, fingers tracing the seams. The boards felt firm but not immovable. If he pressed harder, if he found the right spot, he believed it might give. The thought both steadied and frightened him. This was no longer a matter of curiosity. It was an invitation, left waiting for someone persistent enough to notice. He withdrew his hand, finally, closing the closet door behind him with care, as though he feared the house might hear. In the quiet that followed, he realized the echo had not just revealed space. It had revealed something more unsettling, that behind the wall, the silence was not empty, but alive in some faint and lingering way. He could not yet prove it, but he knew with certainty that the hollow sound was not the end of the discovery. It was the beginning. Night pressed in earlier than he expected, the old house swallowing daylight faster than the town outside. Lamps barely cut through the gloom, their glow dimmed by layers of dust on the glass. He had planned to stop for the evening, to leave the mystery of the closet for another day when his nerves felt steadier. But the hollow sound would not let him rest. It stayed with him like a question, and by the time the hour had stretched toward midnight, he found himself standing once again in front of the closet door, flashlight in hand. The beam cut sharply through the shadows when he switched it on, slicing across warped wood and peeling paint. Inside, the cedar planks looked darker, their lines exaggerated under focus light. He swept the beam slowly across the back wall, determined to study it in detail. At first there was nothing new, only the same faint scratches at the floor, the same faint chill. But where he shifted the light to the right, angling it low and across the surface, something unusual caught his eye. Dust had settled thickly across the boards, yet along one section it clung in a strangely perfect line. A vertical stripe, narrow and precise, ran from the baseboard all the way to the top, as though the wall itself had been sliced and then pressed closed again. It was not visible in daylight, not even when he looked directly at it. Only the flashlight, angled just so, revealed the seam through the way the dust caught its edge. He stepped closer, running his fingertips along the line. The boards felt flush at first, but under the pad of his finger he sensed the faintest shift, a ridge that should not have been there. He traced it upward slowly, heart hammering, until his hand touched the closet's upper edge. The seam was real. It was not imagination, not the irregularity of old wood. It was deliberate, carved and hidden in such a way that only patience or accident could reveal it. Kneeling, he pressed the beam close to the floor. The dust had gathered most heavily where the line met the baseboard, forming a shadowed groove. He cleared it away with his hand, coughing as the fine particles filled the air. Beneath the layer, the wood was lighter, fresher, as though it had been cut long after the rest of the closet had aged. His hand shook slightly as he pressed against it, testing for movement. It did not shift, but the thought that it might gave him both dread and resolve. He stood back, shining the light across the rest of the wall, looking for other irregularities. Now that he knew what to search for, he saw them. Tiny gaps where the grain did not match, subtle misalignments where a board should have run seamlessly. Someone had built this wall not to last, but to conceal. The silence in the room deepened as he stood there, the flashlight beam steady against the seam. He imagined the hands that had done this work, careful but hurried, determined to hide what lay behind. He could almost see them pushing the boards into place, nailing them shut, brushing dust over the surface to mask their effort. A secret built into the house's bones, never meant for light. He leaned his shoulder against the panel and pressed. The wall held firm, but he thought he felt the faintest give, like pressure meeting tension. He withdrew quickly, breathing hard. His thoughts spiraled. Why would his uncle leave him this house? Why here? Why this room? Had the seam been noticed before, or had it waited silently for someone to uncover it? He killed the flashlight and stood in the dark, the line invisible once more. It unnerved him how easily it could vanish, how something so deliberate could disappear into plain sight until the right conditions revealed it. The house seemed to hum faintly in the silence, its old frame settling with tired groans. When he finally left the closet, closing the door gently, he carried the image of the seam with him. It was no longer just suspicion. The space behind the wall was real, and now he had proof. He lay down on the bed, but sleep did not come. In his mind, the vertical line stood tall, a thin door drawn across his thoughts. Behind it, something waited, and the waiting was worse than knowing. He waited until morning, hoping that daylight would wash away the unease of what he had seen the night before. Yet even with the sun pressing through the windows, the house carried the same heavy silence. Dust motes drifted lazily in the light, but the air remained thick, as though the walls were holding their breath. He had slept poorly, the image of the seam following him into every dream, turning rest into a slow grind of unease. When he rose, he knew what the day demanded. The toolbox sat by the door where he had left it after patching a window frame. He lifted it now, the weight familiar, but unwelcome. Each clang of metal inside sounded too loud, echoing in the quiet house. Carrying it upstairs felt like walking toward a verdict. His uncle's key still rested in his pocket, heavy with implication. He wondered if the old man had meant for him to find this, or if he was breaking into something that had been buried for a reason. In the bedroom, The closet door yawned open like an invitation. He no longer had the luxury to refuse. He set the toolbox on the floor, kneeling to pull out a crowbar. Its blackened steel caught the light from the window, dull but solid. He turned it over in his hands, feeling the cold metal seep into his skin. His palms were damp, his grip uncertain. The idea of using it here felt different than fixing a hinge or prying loose a nail board. This was not repair. It was intrusion. He crouched inside the closet, the beam of his flashlight cutting across the hidden seam. The line looked sharper now, no longer disguised once his eyes knew where to rest. He slid the flat edge of the crowbar against the groove, testing the resistance. The wood pushed back stubbornly, unmoving, but the vibration through the steel told him the boards were not anchored as firmly as the rest of the wall. He pressed harder, the tool biting against the seam with a faint creak. Sweat beaded along his forehead as he leaned into the effort. The wood groaned, a long, low sound that seemed to shiver through the closet. He froze, heart hammering, afraid that the noise might stir something hidden beyond. His breath came shallow as he waited, but the silence that followed was absolute. The house seemed to settle again, its noises fading back in the background. He shifted the crowbar to another point along the seam, prying carefully, each motion deliberate. With a sharp crack, a small splinter gave way, falling to the floor. The sound was louder than he expected, the kind of sound that carried in memory long after it faded. He paused, staring at the jagged edge left behind. The broken wood was pale, too clean compared to the aged boards around it, as though what lay behind had been sealed away more recently than he first imagined. He pulled again, harder this time, and another piece yielded, snapping free with reluctant force. The space behind the wall exhaled faintly, a shift in the air so subtle he might have imagined it. Dust swirled in lazy spirals. Disturbed by the opening, his stomach tightened. Every instinct told him this was trespass, that he was peeling back layers meant to stay closed. The crowbar slipped in deeper now, and with each tug, the seam widened. The boards cracked and bent, their nails groaning in protest as they tore free of the frame. His hands trembled with every pull, not from exertion but from the certainty that he was crossing a boundary. He thought of his uncle again, of the silence that had always surrounded the man's name at family gatherings. Some secrets were kept not from neglect, but from necessity, and yet here he was, forcing them into the light. When the first board came loose, he caught it before it could crash to the ground. Lowering it carefully onto the closet floor, he stared into the dark gap it left behind. The space beyond was black, depthless, absorbing the light rather than reflecting it. The smell that drifted out was old, metallic, and unfamiliar, like iron left to rust in damp air. His chest tightened as he leaned closer, flashlight trembling in his grip. The silence behind the wall felt heavier now, thick and expectant. He hesitated, crowbar still in hand, poised on the next board but unwilling to move. Every nerve told him that what he revealed could not be undone. Still, he could not stop. He wedged the tool back into the seam, each creak of shifting was sounding like a warning, each splinter breaking like a voice whispering against his resolve. Piece by piece, the barrier began to fall away, and with it, his certainty that the house was simply old and forgotten. What waited beyond had been hidden with purpose, and he trembled not from fear of discovery, but from the weight of knowing he was now a part of it. The last board broke free with a groan that seemed to echo deeper than the walls themselves. He lowered it carefully to the floor, stacking it beside the others, though the neatness did little to quiet the tremor in his hands. The gap left behind was wide enough now for him to peer through, and the flashlight beam revealed what the house had guarded. Beyond the false wall lay an opening, narrow, suffocating, and thick with shadows that shifted reluctantly under the intrusion of light. Cobwebs stretched across the entry in silvery nets, their threads trembling at the disturbance of air. Dust swirled in lazy spirals, disturbed by his movements, and the smell that drifted out was sharp and stale, as though it had been trapped for decades. He leaned closer, careful not to breathe too deeply, and directed the beam downward. The floor sloped away almost immediately, a rough descent carved from wood and stone, as though the house had been built around this hidden channel. His chest tightened. The passage was not wide, barely enough for a man to squeeze through. The wall seemed to lean inward, crowding the air, and the darkness beyond the reach of the flashlight seemed to grow heavier rather than retreat. He reached forward tentatively, pushing his hand past the ragged edges of the opening. The air inside was colder, startlingly so, the kind of cold that carried not freshness but the weight of earth and neglect. He drew back quickly, shivering despite himself. Standing there in the closet, he was struck by how deliberate it all felt. The false wall had been carefully constructed, the boards cut and fitted to erase the passage from memory. Yet no attempt had been made to seal it entirely. It had not been filled in or bricked over. It had only been hidden, as though whoever closed it had intended that it might one day be found. The flashlight beam wavered in his grip as he aimed it farther into the opening. The passage descended at a shallow angle, uneven steps forming where boards met stone. The walls bore streaks of moisture, dark lines that glistened faintly under the light. Cobwebs layered themselves so thickly across the corners that they looked like curtains. He swallowed hard, the taste of dust and rust clinging to his throat. The thought of entering filled him with a dread he could not name. Yet the alternative, closing the wall again, pretending the passage did not exist, seemed impossible. He had already gone too far. The air that drifted out was not only stale, it was expectant, as though something below waited to be acknowledged. He stood with the flashlight raised, listening for the faintest sound. Nothing came, only silence stretching unbroken, and yet he felt watched all the same. He fetched a handkerchief from his pocket and tied it loosely over his nose and mouth. The gesture felt absurd, like a child preparing for play, but the air smelled wrong, thick with age, and he could not shake the thought that it carried something more than dust. With the crowbar still in one hand and the flashlight in the other, he crouched lower and angled himself toward the opening. The closet seemed smaller now, the world beyond its walls heavier. Kneeling at the threshold, he reached inside once more, this time pushing the beam deeper into the passage. The light revealed only more decline, steps leading downward into a pocket of dark that refused to lift. His skin prickled at the thought of what might lie beyond the beam's reach. He considered calling out, saying something just to hear his own voice answer back, but the idea filled him with unease. In a place like this, words might not return alone. He drew back again, heart pounding in his ears. He sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the dark gap in the closet wall. Every instinct urged caution, yet the scratches on the floorboards, the hollow sound, the hidden seam, all of it had led here. He could not deny the pull any longer. When he finally stood, he approached the opening with renewed resolve. He pressed the flashlight forward, ducked his head under the rim of cobwebs, and eased himself into the narrow space. The boards groaned beneath his weight, dust falling from above in a soft rain. The cold air wrapped around him immediately, numbing his skin. Each step downward was a decision he could not take back. The closet door still stood open behind him, spilling a sliver of daylight into the passage. But with every step he took, the light grew fainter until it was only a thin memory. Ahead stretched nothing but darkness, stale air, and silence, as though he had crossed from one world into another. And though no sound accompanied him, he could not shake the sense that something far below was waiting, patient and unseen. The descent ended in a small landing where the air grew colder, heavy with a dampness that clung to his throat. He steadied the flashlight in one hand and felt the uneven boards beneath his boots groan as though they had not borne weight in years. The narrow walls opened slightly here, forming a chamber large enough for him to stand upright. He swept the beam across it cautiously, bracing himself for what it might reveal. Dust exploded into sight wherever the light touched. It drifted thickly, stirred from its long rest by his intrusion. At first there was only the suggestion of shapes, dark outlines hunching corners, low piles stacked in the shadows. Then the details sharpened. A row of crates, their lids nailed shut, lined one wall. The wood was warped, the nails streaked with rust, but they remained intact. Nearby, a cluster of boxes sat neatly on top of one another, as though placed deliberately, not abandoned in haste. He stepped closer, the floor creaking under his weight, and his light fell on something that made his chest tighten. Against the far wall stood a small rocking chair, its curved runners thick with dust. The seat sagged with rot, but the shape was unmistakable, delicate and scale for a child. A thin layer of cobwebs draped across its back, trembling in the disturbed air. For a moment he could not move, struck by the loneliness of the object. It was not the kind of thing stored for convenience or necessity. It was a piece of life set aside and left behind. His hand shook as he raised the flashlight higher, tracing the perimeter of the chamber. More belongings emerged. A bundle of clothes folded neatly inside a wicker basket. A cracked mirror propped against the wall. Its silver backing flaked away until only fragments of reflection clung to its surface. A trunk half hidden in the corner, leather straps crumbling into threads. Nothing appeared scattered. Every item was arranged carefully, as though someone had lived here long enough to impose order, then departed with the intention of return. But the thick layer of dust said otherwise. He crouched by the nearest crate, running his fingers along the ridged grain of the wood. The boards were soft with age, but still held firm. He tapped lightly, and the sound was dull, muffled. Something was inside, though he could not yet guess what. His instinct told him not to pry it open. Not yet. The weight of intrusion pressed harder with every discovery. It was one thing to break through a false wall, another to disturb possessions that had been arranged and left with care. Turning slowly, he let the flashlight beam settle once more on the rocking chair. The sight of it gnawed at him. The dust on its surface was so thick that it appeared gray. Yet the shape was intact, though it was still strong beneath neglect. He imagined the faint sound it might make if nudged, the creak of which swaying gently in the silence. His throat tightened, and he turned the light away. The boxes stacked near the chair were sealed only with string, now brittle and frayed. He brushed the dust from one, revealing handwriting faded almost to illegibility. Letters and numbers, initials perhaps, or dates, barely survived on the surface. He traced them with a fingertip, but the marks dissolved into nothing under his touch. Whatever meaning they carried had been erased by time. The stillness of the chamber pressed in around him. It was not abandonment that filled the air, but waiting. Every object seemed poised in suspension, untouched but not discarded, as though they had been left for him to find, or for someone else who never came. He lowered himself onto the edge of a crate, his flashlight resting against his knee, and tried to steady his breathing. The cold seeped through the soles of his shoes. He thought of his uncle again, the man whose name had drifted like a shadow through family stories but never settled anywhere. Was this his doing? Had he built this room, stacked these belongings, arranged them so carefully? Or had he only inherited them, just as he himself had inherited the house? The thought unsettled him more deeply than the sight of the objects themselves. The room was not random. It bore the imprint of intention. These were not things discarded into storage. They were fragments of lives, pressed into stillness and left beneath the house, as if the world above had no place for them. When he finally rose, his knees stiff from crouching, the dust clung to his clothes, the air heavy in his lungs. He stood in the center of the chamber, the beam of his light moving slowly across crates, boxes, the fragile rocking chair. Nothing stirred, yet he felt surrounded, observed by the memory of those who had placed these things here. He gripped the flashlight tighter, his other hand tightening unconsciously around the crowbar. He had expected emptiness behind the wall, a void hidden for no reason. Instead, he found a room that felt like a museum of secrets. Every item demanded explanation, and every explanation seemed too heavy for him to bear alone. The silence grew deeper as he stepped back toward the narrow passage, the rocking chair lingering in his mind long after it faded into shadow. The beam of his flashlight slid across the chamber's far corner, and something caught the light in a way the crates and boxes had not. It was not the dull gray of dusted wood, but a warped sheen of old fabric. This was sharper, deliberate. He stepped closer, brushing past cobwebs that clung to his sleeve, and saw a narrow shelf fixed directly into the wall. It was the only part of the space that looked intentional, almost like a small altar built into stone. Upon it rested a single object, thick and square, the weight of it obvious even in shadow. He raised the light higher and saw that it was a ledger. Its spine bulged with age, the leather binding cracked and dry, but the book itself remained intact. Dust coated the cover in a soft blanket, disturbed now by his breath. He reached out slowly, fingers trembling as though they touched more than paper. When he lifted it, the heaviness startled him. The pages, pressed together by decades, groaned as if reluctant to move. He carried it carefully to a crate, setting it down gently before kneeling to open it. The flashlight beam hovered close, its glow spilling across the first yellowed pages. Columns of writing filled the sheet, neat, deliberate, and endless. Names ran down in long succession, each paired with a date. Some stretched back farther than he expected. The earliest scrawled in ink that faded nearly to sepia. Others were written more recently, the lines darker, firmer. He turned the pages slowly, the edges brittle against his fingertips. Every sheet was the same, names, dates, short notations in cramped handwriting. Yet one detail grew clearer with every turn. Many of the names had been crossed out with thick lines, sometimes violently enough to tear through the paper. Others remained untouched, their ink crisp and whole, standing silently in the lists. The contrast unsettled him more than the book itself. What separated those who were struck out from those left intact? Leaning closer, he tried to decipher the notes written beside each entry. Some were only single words, delivered, resolved, cleared. Others stretched into short phrases he could barely make out, scribbled in haste. One entry bore the words still below. Another read, unsettled, watch. The language carried no context, no key to explain their meaning, yet every mark suggested something deliberate, a system maintained carefully over years. He ran his hand down the center binding, tracing the indentation of a pen that had pressed harder than the others. The ink there was darker, fresher. He realized with a chill that these later entries could not have been written long ago. Whoever kept this ledger had done so well into recent decades, perhaps even more recently than he wanted to believe. His uncle's memory returned, vague and shadowed. Had it been his hand that kept his record? If not, then whose? He flipped back to the earlier pages, eyes scanning the first names. Some bore family names he recognized faintly, echoes of the town's older generations, mentioned offhand in stories or carved into headstones at the cemetery. Others were entirely unfamiliar. The longer he stared, the more the list felt like a roll call of forgotten people reduced to ink and lines, stripped of anything beyond their placement here. The silence of the chamber deepened around him, thick and pressing. He felt the presence of the objects at his back, the crates, the boxes, the rocking chair. Yet all attention pulled toward a ledger in his lap. It did not feel like discovery. It felt like intrusion, as though his very act of reading pulled him into a role he was not meant to hold. He lingered on one page where the ink grew shaky, the handwriting less precise. A cluster of names there had been crossed through with frantic slashes, the paper nearly shredded. Beside them, the notation read, "Only, never returned." His throat tightened, and he closed the book slightly, unable to look further. Still, he could not resist one last glance. Toward the back, the handwriting shifted again, neater, almost clinical. A page there bore several names uncrossed, each paired with recent years, and beside them, short words that offered no clarity. Inherited, kept, hidden. He stared until the letters blurred, then closed the ledger fully. The sound of its cover shutting echoed in the stillness like a door closing, heavy and final. He placed the book back on the shelf, though his hand lingered on its cover. The weight of it seemed to press through his skin, settling deeper than the air of the chamber. It was not simply a record. It was a ledger of lives, their meanings reduced to lines, their endings marked by a stroke of ink. He turned away at last, his flashlight trembling as it swept back toward the room. The object around him seemed sharper now, their silence more accusing. He had uncovered more than belongings. He had opened a witness, one that did not forget. He stood for a long time staring at the ledger before finally forcing himself to turn away. The air felt heavier now, as if the very act of reading those names had thickened it. The chamber seemed smaller, pressing closer, demanding he acknowledge more than ink and paper. He swept the flashlight across the room again, determined to see what else had been hidden. The beam caught the crates, the boxes, the rocking chair, but then shifted toward the shadows near the far wall. There, tucked between the stacked belongings, lay objects less orderly, less like storage and more like remnants of daily life. He moved closer, brushing past cobwebs that clung to his shoulders and hair. The smell shifted as he approached, less the stale dryness of dust and more the metallic tang of rust. He angled the light downward and saw a lantern sitting crooked against the wall. Its glass was cracked, the metal frame pitted with corrosion, but the handle still arched intact above it. He crouched, fingertips brushing its surface. The rust flaked away easily, staining his skin. This had been carried once, held by someone's hand, used to cast light in this very darkness. He imagined its glow filling the chamber, throwing shadows across the same walls where he now stood. Beside it, half buried under a fallen board, lay several food tins. Their labels had peeled away long ago, leaving only dull metal, dented and ringed with corrosion. He picked one up carefully and shook it. Nothing moved inside, only the faintest rattle of desiccated contents. He set it back down gently. There were more, stacked in a small pile, their placement deliberate. Whoever left them had relied on them, consuming some, saving others. It was no accident they were here. The flashlight beam drifted further, and his breath caught. Against the wall stretched a narrow cot, its frame bent under the weight of time. The canvas had rotted through, sagging in the middle, but its shape was unmistakable. A bed. The sight of it unsettled him more deeply than anything else. Crates and boxes could be explained as storage, a ledger as record-keeping. But a bed spoke of habitation. Someone had lived here. Someone had spent nights lying beneath the earth, breathing the same heavy air, listening to the same silence. He stepped closer, crouching to examine the cot. Dust layered it thickly, yet faint depressions lingered in the fabric, as though the shape of a body had imprinted itself and refused to fade. The sight made his throat tighten. He touched the edge lightly, and the canvas crumbled beneath his fingers, disintegrating into powder. He drew back quickly, wiping his hand on his pants, heart beating too fast. The questions came without answer. Who had lived here? Why had they chosen, or been forced, to stay in such a place? From what had they been hiding? He turned the light toward the walls, half expecting to find carvings or writing that might explain. Only the damp streaks of moisture stared back at him, dark lines etched by time. The silence pressed harder. He sat back on his heels, forcing himself to breathe evenly. The food tins, the lantern, the cot, they were not relics of storage. They were evidence of life. The chamber was not only a hiding place for objects, but for a person, perhaps many. The ledger's names echoed in his mind, each one paired with dates and strange notations. Had those people been here? Had their lives been reduced to rations, a dim lantern, and restless nights on a sagging cot? The thought chilled him more than the air itself. His uncle's memory loomed again, vague, shadowed. Was he the one who had lived down here, or had he simply kept a secret? The ledger suggested something larger, a system of recording, of marking lives. Yet the objects here suggested something far more intimate. The daily effort of survival in silence, pressed into corners of a hidden room. He leaned back against a crate, staring across the chamber. The rocking chair stood motionless in the corner, dust thick on its runners. The lantern sat silent in its rust, the tins in their pile, the cot slumped in defeat. Together they painted a picture of existence both fragile and deliberate. Whoever had been here had not meant to leave traces for discovery, and yet the room held him still, testifying in silence. He rubbed his hands over his face, feeling the grit of dust against his skin. The house above seemed very far away now, almost unreal. Up there, light filtered through windows. Wind rattled the shutters. Boards creaked under ordinary weight. Down here, everything was preserved, held still, waiting. He stood slowly, lifting the flashlight once more. Its beam trembled across the room, as if mirroring his own unease. He thought of the ledger's words, notations like "still below" and "never returned," and felt the weight of the chamber pressing more insistently. Whoever had once lived here had not been hiding by chance. They had been hiding with purpose. He backed away from the cot, careful not to disturb it further, and let the light sweep over the chamber one last time. The objects told their story plainly enough. Someone had lived in hiding here, but not why, not from whom, and not for how long. The silence refused to give him more. And it was that refusal, more than the object themselves, that made the hair on his arms rise. Something about this room was not finished. Something about it still breathed. The beam of his flashlight wavered as he turned from the cot. The air in the chamber seemed to press more heavily now, the silence dense enough that every breath he drew sounded intrusive. He let the light sweep slowly along the walls, expecting only damp streaks and the rough seams of stone. Instead, the beam caught on lines that were too precise to be natural, markings carved deliberately into the surface. He stepped closer, heart tightening as the shapes revealed themselves. The walls were covered. At first it was only shallow scratches, faint and uneven, but then more details emerged. Symbols layered upon symbols. Some simple initials pressed into stone with care, others strange figures whose meaning he could not guess. They ran in uneven rows, stretching from near the floor up to where the wall met the ceiling. In places they overlapped, one mark cutting through another as though whoever made them had run out of space or had needed to leave their trace urgently. He crouched, aiming the light low, and saw tally marks clustered in tight groups. Lines scratched one after another, forming bundles of 5, then more, stretching across wide swaths of wall. Some were neat, each line measured carefully. Others were frantic, jagged, gouged so deep the stone had cracked around them. He ran his fingers lightly over one set, feeling the sharpness still present even under layers of dust. The rock had resisted, but not enough. Whoever carved these had pressed with force and desperation. He rose slowly, the light climbing higher, and the marks continued. Initials repeated, some paired with dates, others standing alone. A few symbols looked almost like crude drawings, shapes resembling eyes, crosses, circles with lines radiating outward. None followed a single pattern. They looked more like the accumulation of different hands over different times, each leaving something behind in the only way they could. One section caught his eye more than the rest. Near the cot, where the moisture had darkened the stone, a cluster of carvings stood out. A name, or what seemed to be a name, had been etched so forcefully that the letters were nearly an inch deep. Beside it, dozens of tally marks formed an unbroken stretch, as though someone had counted every day until the wall could take no more. The last marks ended abruptly, the surface fracture where the tool had broken through. He stepped back, staring, unsettled by the sudden silence of it. The counting had stopped. He moved along the wall, his beam catching other patterns. Some carvings seemed almost ritualistic, repeated shapes aligned in rows. Others were smaller, tentative, as if scratched by a weak hand. His stomach tightened at the thought that more than one person had lived down here, each adding their own marks, their own testament to time endured. The room was not simply storage. It was memory carved into stone, each line a fragment of existence preserved by necessity. The cracks around some of the deeper etchings troubled him. In places, chunks of stone had flaked away, leaving scars where symbols had once been. He imagined the effort it took, the hours of pressure and repetition, a hand pressing again and again until the stone surrendered. There was anger in those marks, or desperation so fierce it had no other outlet. He leaned closer to another cluster, his light tracing across initials paired with dates from decades ago. Some of the letters were familiar, matching names he had seen in the ledger. His throat tightened as recognition settled in. The book had recorded them, but the walls bore their own witness. These were not just names written in ink. These were people who had stood here, carving themselves into the stone, so they could not be erased. The silence of the chamber grew heavier, filled now with the presence of unseen voices. He felt surrounded by them, each mark a whisper that refused to fade. He stepped back toward the center of the room, the beam of his light falling across walls covered in testimony. The space seemed to close around him, alive with memory and insistence. He gripped the flashlight tighter, trying to steady his hand, but the unease would not leave him. These carvings were not decoration, not idle marks of boredom. They were records layered and unrelenting, proof that people had lived here, suffered here, waited here. Some had counted the days. Others had pressed names so deeply into stone that even time could not erase them. Together, they told a story he could not yet read, but one that wrapped itself around him nonetheless. When he finally turned back toward the passage, the carvings seemed to follow, the lines etched into his vision as surely as they were into the walls. The chamber no longer felt empty. It felt inhabited, each scratch a presence that refused to leave. And as he stepped toward the narrow exit, the sound of his own breath seemed loud against the silence of those who had carved themselves into stone. The carvings lingered in his mind as he swept the flashlight slowly across the chamber again. His pulse had steadied, but the silence was heavier than before, as though the stone itself held on to every sound he made. Dust drifted lazily in the narrow beam, and for a moment he thought he'd seen everything there was to see. The cot sagging against the wall, the crates, the rocking chair, the ledger. Yet the light caught on something sharp, a glint that did not belong to stone or wood. He turned back, narrowing the beam. Near the base of the far wall, half hidden beneath fallen debris, lay a piece of glass. It was angled just enough to catch the light, fractured but still whole enough to shine faintly. He crouched, moving aside a splintered board to clear the way. As he shifted the fragments, the glass tilted and revealed what it had been covering. Beneath it, pinned flat against a stone by its weight, was a photograph. His hand hesitated before reaching down. The glass had protected the image from years of dust, but the edges were still curled, the paper yellowed. Carefully, he lifted the shard away and set aside. The photograph clung slightly to the stone before releasing, and he held it gently in his hand, afraid it might crumble at his touch. The beam of the flashlight revealed faces, black and white, blurred slightly with age, but clear enough that the features stood out. A group of people posed stiffly, their clothes formal, their shoes polished despite the dirt road beneath their feet. Adults stood in the back row, their eyes shadowed and unsmiling, while children clustered in front. His gaze caught immediately on one boy near the center. The face was smaller, rounder, but familiar in a way that made his chest tighten. It was his uncle, years younger, no more than 10, standing rigid with his arms at his sides. He brought the photograph closer, the light trembling as it washed across the faces. The uncle he remembered from rare visits in his own childhood had been distant, quiet, with eyes that seemed to look through more than at. But here the boy's expression was different. There was unease in it, a kind of stiffness not born of the photographer's command but of fear. The other children did not look much different. Their clothes were neat, but their postures were rigid, their expressions tense. He scanned the adults standing behind them. None of the faces were familiar. Men in dark coats, women in heavy dresses, all with the same fixed expressions, all staring directly into the lens. Something about their eyes unsettled him, the clarity with which they had been captured, sharp even as the paper had faded. They were strangers, but the way they seemed to lean toward the children suggested possession more than care. Turning the photograph slightly, he examined its edges. On the back, faint writing still clung to the surface, scrawled in pencil. The date was just barely legible, a year nearly 7 decades past. No names, no place, only the number written hastily, as though to remind but not to explain. He rubbed his thumb over it, feeling the grain of the paper, the indentations left by the pencil pressing hard. The unease deepened. Why would this photograph be here, buried under glass in a hidden chamber? Why would his uncle as a boy be standing among strangers, captured in a moment that looked more like documentation than memory? He imagined the photograph being placed here deliberately, pinned down to survive, as though someone had wanted it kept but not displayed. A record, not a keepsake. He turned it back over, studying his uncle's face again. The boy's eyes were cast slightly away from the camera, not in disobedience, but as if drawn towards something outside the frame. The adults loomed larger in the background, their gazes stark and unyielding. He felt an involuntary shiver as he realized none of the figures bore even the faintest trace of a smile. It was as though joy had been forbidden in the very act of standing there. The longer he looked, the more oppressive the image became. He lowered it finally, sliding it back under the shard of glass where it had been preserved. He did not want to carry it with him. Not yet. The sight of his uncle as a child, framed by strangers whose presence seemed to drain the air from the room, left him unsettled in a way that no tally mark or ledger had managed. This was not only evidence of life hidden in the chamber, it was evidence of connection, his family tied directly to whatever had been concealed here. He stood slowly, brushing dust from his knees, the air thick with the faint smell of rust and stone. The flashlight beam drifted across the chamber once more, but the photograph stayed in his thoughts. sharper than anything the light revealed. His uncle had been part of this place, not by chance but by design. And now, by stepping into the hidden room, he had stepped into that same design, whether he wanted to or not. The photograph lingered in his thoughts long after he had returned it beneath the shard of glass. He kept seeing the boy's eyes turn slightly away from the lens, the adults behind him rigid and silent. The unease of that image made every object in the chamber feel heavier, more deliberate. When his flashlight beam drifted to the farthest corner, he saw something that seemed to hold the weight of the room itself. It was a trunk, larger than any of the boxes or crates, set apart from the rest as though deliberately placed out of reach. Its wood was dark, almost blackened with age, and thick iron bands wrapped around it, now mottled with rust. A heavy lock secured the front, the metal eaten through in places, but still intact enough to hold. Dust lay in deep layers across the lid, broken only by faint scratches where something had disturbed it long ago. He approached slowly, crouching beside it, the air colder here than in the rest of the chamber. The trunk smelled of iron and damp wood, a sharp tang that stung his throat. He set the flashlight on a crate, so both hands were free, then gripped the lock. It was stubborn, refusing to yield even under pressure. He pulled at it with both hands, the rust biting into his skin, but it held firm. His crowbar lay where he had left it near the closet opening. He fetched it, the scrape of metal against stone sounding loud in the silence. Kneeling again, he slid the flat edge of the bar into the lock, pressing with steady force. The metal groaned, rust flaking away in small showers. He pressed harder, sweat beading at his temple. The sound echoed faintly, as though the chamber itself objected to the intrusion. Finally, with a sharp crack, the lock gave way, snapping open in a burst of dust and rusted fragments. He hesitated, staring at the trunk. The silence afterward was so complete it seemed to swallow even his breathing. With trembling hands, he pressed the crowbar under the lid and pried. At first it resisted, the swollen wood clinging stubbornly to itself. Then, slowly, it began to lift, the hinges screaming in protest. The smell that rose up was sour and metallic, thicker than before, enough to make him cover his nose with his sleeve. He pushed the lid higher, the beam of the flashlight catching the contents inside. He had half expected treasure, some hidden wealth explaining the secrecy of the room. Instead, what lay inside made his stomach turn. Bundles of papers, bound with twine, filled much of the trunk. Many were yellowed, brittle at the edges, their ink faded, but among them were objects that seemed out of place. A pair of shoes, small, scuffed, the leather cracked from use. A child's doll, its porcelain face fractured down the middle, one glass eye missing. A length of rope coiled neatly, the fibers stiff with age. He reached in slowly, picking up one of the bundles of papers. The twine snapped easily under his fingers, and the sheets fanned open in his hand. They were letters, pages of cramped handwriting spilling across every line. He scanned the first quickly, but the words struck him like blows. Mentions of debt, of silence, of people who would not be seen again. No explanations, only fragments, but enough to suggest something far darker than storage. Setting the papers aside, he lifted the doll. Dust crumbled from its cracked face, the painted smile warped by the fracture. It was not the kind of thing someone would keep by accident. He placed it back carefully, unwilling to hold it longer. The rope beneath it unsettled him even more, not because of what it was, but because it had been placed here deliberately, coiled as though waiting. He pushed the papers and objects aside, searching deeper, and his hand brushed against something hard. He pulled it free, a ledger smaller than the one on the shelf, but filled with the same careful writing. Names appeared again, paired with dates, but here the notations were different. Words like delivered and taken filled the margins, some underlined heavily. Many of the names had been crossed out, the ink jagged, violent. He set the book down quickly, his breath coming faster. This was no collection of valuables, no inheritance worth claiming. It was evidence of what he could not yet bring himself to name. The objects were not random. They were personal, intimate, each tied to someone whose name now lived in ink and scratches on stone. The trunk stood open before him, the weight of its contents pressing harder than gold ever could. He stepped back slowly, the flashlight beam trembling in his hand. The chamber felt different now, heavier, as though the objects themselves had exhaled their silence into him. He had not uncovered wealth. He had uncovered memory, locked away because it was too terrible to be left in the light. The papers lay in uneven stacks inside the trunk, bundled in twine that had dried and frayed, until it snapped with the faintest tug. He hesitated before touching them again, the smell of old ink and mildew sharp in the air. These were not casual notes or ledgers of business. The sheer volume of them, packed tightly and hidden so carefully, suggested something that had not been meant to survive in plain sight. Yet here they were, waiting, preserved by secrecy. He pulled one bundle free and untied it carefully. The letters inside were written in cramped script, the ink faded but still legible. The first opened easily, its fold creaking like brittle bone. He read slowly, words forming in fragments at first. Names of people he did not know, mentions of nights when someone left town and never came back. The tone was matter-of-fact, not mournful, as though disappearance were nothing more than an entry in a ledger. The next letter deepened the unease. It spoke of debts, of promises never fulfilled. A man had borrowed too much, and when he could not repay, his name was written here in a hand that felt coldly precise. Settled. The note said at the end, the word underlined twice. He felt his stomach tighten as he folded the page back down. One by one, he unfolded more, each piece of paper adding to the same grim pattern. Families fractured, workers who vanished after taking advances, strangers who came through town and never left again. The letters did not explain where they had gone or what had happened, only that they were gone, and that someone had marked it as business concluded. He shifted through the bundle, his hand trembling as he recognized the surname of a family that still lived in town, people he had passed in the market during rare visits. Their grandfather's name appeared here, paired with a phrase, resolved with silence. He could hear his own breathing echo against the chamber walls, louder than he wanted it to be. At the bottom of the stack, he found something more personal. The handwriting here was different, sharper, as though pressed harder into the page. It mentioned his uncle directly, not by name, but by initial, paired with short notes of involvement. Held by J in trust. Debt secured by J. Delivered through J. The chill spread deeper as he read. His uncle had not simply inherited this house. He had been part of what happened here. Another bundle broke open as he shifted it, letters spilling across the floor. He picked one at random, unfolding it under the trembling beam of the flashlight. This one was longer, almost like a confession. It described a man who had come to town seeking work, staying briefly in a boarding house. When he disappeared, his belongings were collected quietly, stored with the others. The town will not ask, the letter concluded. It is better they do not know. He set it down, his throat dry, the words blurred together in his mind, fragments of testimony written without expectation of being read. These were not warnings or apologies. They were records of complicity, preserved with care. He pulled another sheet, this one written in his uncle's hand. He knew it instantly, the angular letters sharp with the same restraint he remembered from short notes and signatures. Keep silent. It read at the end of the page, after describing a debt that had ended in disappearance. He stared at the phrase until the letters seemed to shift on the page, the meaning pressing into him like weight. The chamber seemed to close in tighter as he set the letters back into the trunk. The rocking chair loomed in the corner. The cot sagged with unseen memory. The carvings on the walls pressed from every side. His uncle had been part of this. Not only part of it, but one of those who ensured the silence endured. He closed the trunk slowly. Though it did not latch, the broken lock leaving it gaping slightly open. The air felt colder now, the dust thicker, the silence less empty. He sat back on his heels, the letters echoing in his mind. Names reduced to records, lives reduced to debts unpaid. And his uncle, the distant man who had left him this house, standing at the center of it. The inheritance no longer felt accidental. It felt deliberate, as though the house and its secrets had been passed down not as a gift, but as a burden. He lifted the flashlight again, its beam shaking as it cut across the chamber. The walls seemed to lean closer, each carved tally an etched symbol bearing witness to what the letters had confessed. He pressed the lid of the trunk down with both hands, feeling the wood resist before settling into place. The broken lock hung loose, its fragments scattered on the floor, but the weight of the contents inside seemed to radiate outward even with the trunk shut. The smell of rust and mildew clung to his palms. He wiped them against his pants, though it did nothing to remove the heaviness he carried now. The silence of the chamber was unchanged, but it no longer felt empty. It felt aware, as if the act of opening the trunk had awakened something that had been waiting patiently in the dark. He sat back against a crate, the flashlight balanced across his lap, its beam drifting across the room in slow arcs. Everywhere it touched, the object seemed sharper, more accusatory. The rocking chair in the corner no longer looked like a forgotten relic, but a marker of absence. The cot sagged beneath dust, but retained the faint impression of a body. The carvings on the walls, once only puzzling, pressing on him now as testimony, layered voices shouting in silence. The ledger on the shelf seemed heavier than stone. He had touched all of it, broken the wall, forced the boards aside, pried open the trunk. He had turned himself into a keeper of what should have remained hidden. The letters he had read replayed in fragments. Debts unpaid, names crossed out, disappearances written in a hand that refused explanation. He thought of the photograph. His uncle as a boy standing stiffly among strangers, the distant gaze that avoided the camera. The connection tightened until it felt like a noose. The man he had inherited the house from had not been a quiet recluse by chance. He had carried this with him, the same burden now resting in his hands. He rose slowly, the beam of light trembling as it traced the walls once more. He closed the ledger on the shelf without opening it again, but the names remained in his mind. They would not leave. His fingers brushed against the carvings as he passed, each groove a reminder that someone had once stood in the same space, pressing themselves into the stone so they would not vanish completely. He felt the uneven edges cut faintly against his skin, and it struck him that in touching them, he was acknowledging their permanence. At the threshold of the passage, he paused. The narrow steps back up to the closet seemed steeper now, the faint square of light at the top impossibly far away. He looked back once, the flashlight beam lingering over the chamber. The trunk sat quiet in the corner, but the silence that held it was different. It was not the silence of emptiness. It was the silence of something witnessed and unwilling to fade. He turned away quickly, ducking beneath the cobwebs, climbing slowly until the boards of the closet floor creaked beneath his boots. In the bedroom, the air felt thin and strange. The walls carried the same peeling wallpaper, the same sagging ceiling, but they no longer seemed like neglect alone. They carried memory. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the house in the wind, sounded like a reminder. He shut the closet door, but could not bring himself to latch it. The space behind that thin wall was no longer hidden. It lived inside him now, unsealed, impossible to forget. He sat on the edge of the bed, the flashlight switched off, the crowbar resting loosely in his hand. The house hummed faintly around him, the sound of pipes, of wood expanding and settling. But beneath it all was something steadier, the weight of discovery pressing down until he could hardly breathe. This was not an inheritance. It was a confession passed into his keeping. The thought gnawed at him as he lay back against the mattress. The house was no longer just a building of beams and boards. It was a witness, and now he was part of its memory. He had seen what had been hidden, read the letters that had reduced lives to notes and debts. He could not unknow them, and in knowing, he had become what his uncle had once been, the silent bearer of what the house refused to release. Sleep did not come. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the tally marks carved into stone, the doll with its fractured smile, the photograph of his uncle as a boy surrounded by strangers. The darkness of the room above felt no lighter than the darkness below. He understood now that he had not uncovered a secret to solve. He had stepped into a legacy, one that watched him from every corner of the house.